Joining me now, Stephen Collinson, CNN politics and senior reporter, Sabrina Singh, Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary under President Biden, and Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Obama administration. Joel, I want to start with you because last week when we were talking about this window of time for diplomacy, you said, well, is it clear that they want diplomacy or is this a cover for something else? So how are you feeling reading this news over the weekend?
Well, Audie, it's quite a moment when I realized that my inner Donald Trump prediction meter is working because, I think right now we are in a moment of uncertainty and at a new precipice. President Trump is changing his message every day. He's now talking about regime change. And, one of the things I'm watching, just even in the reporting that you had a moment ago, is that the Israelis seem to have taken that signal. And now maybe they're trying to find a way to get a jailbreak, a way to stir up the passions inside of Tehran against the regime. He did this when he talked about Gaza and Riviera, and then the Israelis, the IDF, decided to go for it in much of its actions in Gaza. And so I think we're going to see the president continue to push forward rather than look backward because we don't quite know, let's just close with this, we don't quite know what the bombing damage assessment is.
Exactly. We're going to be talking about that in the show today.
And so he'll go forward.
It was interesting. You were saying that this is like the capstone military strike of the post-October 7th era. And Sabrina, you were pointing out 25-minute operation for 75 strikes. So it was designed for impact. Unfortunately, we don't know what that impact is. What are you looking for going forward?
It was an incredibly complex operation. I mean, you cannot deny the professionalism of our military when it came to this operation. I think there's a lot to be determined, and the battle damage assessment is ongoing on how effective these strikes were. Essentially, what's going to happen over the next few days is different intelligence agencies across the administration are going to be looking for chatter to see what people are talking about, how damaged things are. And then, of course, there's the human sources, either on the ground or all around the world, that they'll be getting collection from. I think it's still too early to tell, but to say that some of these facilities have been severely damaged, I think that is accurate, and that's what you heard from the chairman yesterday.
Stephen, you were writing about this being a gamble for this president, right? That if he kind of failed to destroy the program to the extent he's talking about, there are other kinds of ramifications to deal with. Can you talk about that gamble? What else do you think is on the table?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really interesting unknowns here. The first one is, did the Iranians move some of this material out of these facilities? Do they have some covert facilities that are not known to the International Atomic Energy Agency? Could they therefore push towards some kind of rudimentary device, reasoning that this is the only way that they save the regime? And I don't think it's clear from talking to people that know about this that we don't know, and we may never know, and there's always going to be this uncertainty, even though this raid and the Israeli operation was to try and create certainty and to lift the threat, an existential threat from Israel. The other thing is, getting into the president's comments about regime change, another gamble is, what is he unleashing here? It's unlikely, given the political situation in Iran, that it's suddenly going to produce some kind of pro-Western, democratic, pro-Israel government. You could end up with a hardline government coming out of the guard if the clerical regime is toppled or weakened. So history shows us we don't need any new examples of how assumptions and shock and awe beginnings of American wars in the Middle East can unravel over time.
All right, I want you guys to stay with me because we're going to talk about a couple angles of this today. CNN's ongoing breaking news coverage out of the Middle East continues. We're going to talk about the potential for Iranian retaliation, the dire warning about the threat of sleeper cells in the U.S., plus how successful was the U.S.'s attempt to knock out Iran's nuclear program after all.
Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
But the president's message for peace seems to be falling on deaf ears for Iranian leaders who are promising everlasting consequences.
In accordance with the UN Charter and its provisions allowing a legitimate response in self-defense, Iran reserves all options to defend its security, interests, and people.
Okay, my panel is back with me. And Stephen, you were writing over the weekend that you can't necessarily, maybe Trump is trying to bomb Iran to the negotiating table, essentially just making it that they're in a surrender capacity.
Right. That seemed to be the initial plan, at least from the rhetoric that we saw on Saturday night and what followed through. And this idea that the way is now open for Iran. Several of the senior administration officials on TV yesterday were saying, we can have a partnership with Iran, which seems an extraordinary thing to say after you've just sent, B-2 bombers halfway around the world to bomb the country. It seems like this is a long shot because the Iranian Revolution, the regime for the last 46 years, its core principle in many ways has been opposition to the United States. There's a deep-set feeling that the United States is a colonial power throughout modern Iranian history. That said, a lot of the options that Iran has to respond to the United States, they all come with a downside, whether it's bombing U.S. bases in the region, which would precipitate a big response, and even that regime change option from the U.S. and Israel, but also, action elsewhere in the region. There are a lot of Iranian diaspora in the Gulf states, for example. There's lots of financial problems with closing down the Straits of Hormuz. So it doesn't look like the Iranians have a lot of good options to respond that don't intensify this.
Joel, I want to play for you something from a House lawmaker, someone on the House Intel Committee, a ranking Democrat, Jim Hines, because here we're talking about the idea of coming back to the table. Meanwhile, over in Congress, you're starting to hear rumblings of, hey, wait a minute, should we be involved in this? What's the intelligence? People asking questions. Here's what he had to say.
I learned about this strike last night on Twitter. As a member of the Gang of Eight, you might think that for something this consequential, we would be informed of any change in intelligence. And by the way, let's not lose sight of the fact that that an offensive attack against a foreign nation is something that the Constitution reserves to the Congress of the United States. So bad enough that we weren't informed, but, unconstitutional.
I realize this is kind of for both of you because I can't imagine a White House wanting their surprise attack being told to Congress first. But Joel, let me start with you. What did you hear in that?
Yeah, what I heard right there was Congressman Hines saying this is a major process foul, that you need to get the process right if you're going to have an ongoing commitment of American military power in the region towards Iran. And the administration is already starting in the wrong way. That said, I think there is space within the War Powers Resolution and the Act statute for the president to have taken the strikes that he did. But now we're in the debate phase on the Hill. Congressman Hines, my understanding is he's going to join with Adam Smith and Greg Meeks, the leaders of national security committees in the House for Democrats, to try to push forward legislation. And you shouldn't have process fouls in times of war. It should be bipartisan from the get-go.
But the question has always been, when are we officially at war? When we look back at presidents who have used authorizations for the use of military force, it's going all the way back to George W. Bush. How do you think about this, Sabrina?
I think there's clearly room within the War Powers Act that allows presidents to take advantage of acting unilaterally in the interests of Americans.
For limited strikes.
For limited strikes.
Like that.
And, you saw that when we were conducting strikes in the Biden administration against the Houthis. But this goes back, whether it be Bosnia under, President Clinton, Libya under President Obama, should Congress be consulted? Absolutely. Congress plays a role, and these are representatives who represent Americans. I think what was concerning, what I heard from Democratic lawmakers, is that they didn't get the same briefing that their Republican counterparts, Senator Thune, Mike Johnson, they were just told strikes are happening. And that, to me, is really concerning because even though these are Democratic members, they still represent all Americans in their districts, including Republicans, Democrats, Independents. They deserve to have those full briefings as well.
Interesting. You guys stay with me. We've got more to talk about next in this breaking news coverage of the U.S. strikes in Iran. The U.S. claims to have done monumental damage to Iran's nuclear weapons facilities. Iran says they moved their supplies last week. So what is the status of the nuclear program this morning? Okay, so we are starting this week in this major moment, right? You saw strikes there that Fred was just reporting on. And in the meantime, in the U.S., conversation about regime change. President Trump is now floating the idea of that. He posted on social media, quote, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be regime change?" And for some Iranians, that might not be such a bad idea.
I'm actually thankful about that to President Trump. But at the same time, we Iranian people inside of here, the States and outside, we were expecting a regime change. We were expecting United States and Israel help us to get rid of this dictator regime.
Joining me now, my panel, I wanted to talk about this because lawmakers will be back this week, but we'll hear these rumblings of concerns here and there. And I want to play one more thing for you, which is what we are hearing from the administration when they are asked about, Trump saying it's a kind of politically charged term. But here's what they said when they were asked about regime change.
This wasn't a regime change move.
Our view has been very clear that we don't want a regime change. We do not want to protract this or build this out any more than it's already been built out.
I'm not shocked that J.D. Vance is delivering that message. Stephen, you?
Right. I think the question is, I think a lot of people in the administration would like a regime change. The question is whether they're going to push for a regime change. The issue here is these events do tend to gather their own momentum. We went from a week ago, just over a week ago, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, saying we had nothing to do with this, to U.S. bombing. And now, within 8 days, 9 days, the word regime change is again on the lips of many people in Washington. This whole U.S. showdown started with Iran, with regime change. Back in 1953, the CIA British coup to overthrow the Prime Minister, Mossadegh. The lesson, and I'm going to keep going back to lessons of history because things don't always, work out the same way. But regime change plotted in Washington have a pretty bad record of working out well for the United States.
But they start with those military moments, right? And those successes of saying, as we heard our guests earlier, that, okay, there's a bold move and therefore we can follow it up. Is it fair, though, as Americans hear the term regime change and think boots on the ground? Are those just linked, or are they actually linked militarily?
I don't think that a regime change necessarily means boots on the ground.
Yeah, here's Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeting about this this weekend, saying American troops have been killed and forever torn apart physically and mentally for regime change.
I don't, in this day and age, with the type of capabilities that we have, I don't know that that means boots on the ground, and I don't know that this administration is there in committing boots on the ground for a, quote, potential regime change. But I think what's important here is what we don't know. We have not had a diplomatic presence in Iran for some 20 years. So we don't even know what the inner workings of a diplomatic regime change could even look like. That is really for the Iranian people to chart their course on. If we expedite that in some way, if the Israelis expedite that in some way, again, we have a lot of unknowns. And right now, I don't know that this administration wants to pull Americans into a larger war.
Yeah, Joel, how are you seeing this debate play out, especially on the right?
Sure. Well, Audie, the administration needs to decide if it wants regime change or to change the regime's behavior. That's the core decision. And President Trump is sort of throwing out a lot of different ideas, making a mess of it. It's a toxic term to the American public across the board. I served in the Bush administration when we invaded Iraq. Regime change came, and it became this magnet, Iraq did, where it just sucked us in. And so I think the United States, we need to be very careful that the goal here was the nuclear program. Stick to that. We need to supercharge our diplomacy. The president's going to meet with NATO.
Yeah, but isn't it hard to stick to that, right?
It is extremely hard to stick to that.
Because you can hear the language bleeding back and forth, right? Like first it's the nuclear facility, then it's the ambition, then it's the capability, and those seem vaguer or more hard to quantify.
Perceived success accelerates that thought. But 6 weeks ago in Saudi Arabia, the president said words to the effect of the people that pushed interventionism over the last 20 years were interfering in societies they didn't understand. That seems to be the point where we may be crossing over to
Yeah,
Iran.
and though we are very far away from that point, if he is now saying make Iran great again, but literally inserting this idea into the very core of his sort of public persona.
Which will only mobilize the Iranian people behind the Iranian regime, because they don't want to have a foreign intervention overthrow the government, no matter how much they detest that government.
Yes, although it's hard to tell because over the years they have suppressed oppression so effectively in Iran. So as you said, we don't know what could come after, if there is an after. I want to thank you guys for bringing your expertise here with me this morning. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being with us. I'm Audie Cornish. We're going to have the headlines with CNN News.